The humid morning air clung to Magazine Street like a damp shroud as Claire Boudreaux swept the front steps of her Victorian shotgun house. September in New Orleans always felt oppressive, but on this particular Tuesday in 1990, something felt different. The weight in the air seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on the Garden District with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Claire paused her sweeping to watch her 7-year-old son Marcus chase their tabby cat Beignet around the oak tree in their small front yard. His laughter echoed off the narrow houses lining the street, a pure sound that made her smile despite the growing unease she couldn't shake. Marcus had inherited her late husband's infectious joy, his dark eyes sparkling with mischief as he cornered the cat near the front gate. Before we continue with Claire and Marcus's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we share these deeply human stories together. At 32, Claire had been raising Marcus alone for 3 years, ever since her husband David died in an industrial accident at the port of New Orleans. The life insurance had been enough to keep the house and provide for Marcus, but Claire supplemented their income by working evenings at Café du Monde, serving beignets and café au lait to tourists who wandered into the French Quarter after dark. It wasn't glamorous work, but it allowed her to be home during the day when Marcus needed her most. The phone rang from inside the house, its shrill tone cutting through the morning calm. Claire set her broom against the porch rail and called to Marcus. "Stay in the yard, baby. Mama's getting the phone." She hurried through the narrow hallway, past the formal living room they rarely used, to the kitchen where the rotary phone hung on the wall next to the refrigerator. The caller ID hadn't reached most New Orleans homes yet, so Claire had no idea who might be calling at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. "Hello?" she answered, slightly breathless. "Mrs. Boudreaux, this is Linda Tran from St. Augustine Elementary. I'm calling because Marcus hasn't arrived for school yet, and his first period teacher wanted me to check if he's feeling well today." Claire's grip tightened on the receiver. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "Marcus doesn't start school until next week. I have all his enrollment paperwork right here on the counter." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Boudreaux, today is September 4th. School started yesterday. We sent multiple letters over the summer about the start date." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her free hand reaching for the kitchen counter to steady herself. September 4th. But that couldn't be right. She had been so careful about the school calendar, had marked it on the calendar hanging next to the phone. Her eyes moved to the calendar and her blood ran cold. The page still showed August. With trembling fingers, Claire flipped the calendar page forward. September 4th, 1990. Tuesday. The date she had circled in red marker months ago, with Marcus starts 2nd grade, written in her careful cursive below. "Mrs. Boudreaux, are you still there?" Yes, I'm here. There must have been some confusion. We'll be right there." Claire hung up the phone and ran to the front door, her heart pounding. The yard was empty. The front gate stood open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. "Marcus!" she called, her voice cracking. "Marcus, where are you, baby?" She ran barefoot down Magazine Street, calling his name, checking behind parked cars and peering into neighboring yards. Mrs. Thibodeau from next door emerged from her house, coffee mug in hand. "Claire, honey, what's wrong?" "Have you seen Marcus? He was just here in the yard, and now—" "I saw him about 10 minutes ago," Mrs. Thibodeau said, setting down her mug. "He was walking toward the corner with a woman. I figured it was someone you knew, maybe his aunt or something." They were holding hands. Claire's legs nearly gave out. "What woman? What did she look like?" "I didn't get a good look. Medium height, brown hair, I think. She was wearing a blue dress." They turned the corner towards St. Charles Avenue. Without another word, Claire ran toward St. Charles, her bare feet slapping against the hot pavement. The streetcar tracks gleamed in the morning sun, and tourists were already beginning to gather at the nearby stop, cameras in hand. But there was no sign of Marcus or the mysterious woman. She ran back to her house and called the police. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, but Claire could barely focus on the questions being asked. How old was her son? What was he wearing? When did she last see him? The answers tumbled out of her in a rush. 7 years old, red t-shirt and blue shorts, 5 minutes ago in their front yard. "Mom, I need you to calm down," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." In most cases like this, children turn up within a few hours. Is there anyone Marcus might have gone to see? Family members? Friends from school? Claire's mind raced. Marcus was shy around strangers, but he was also trusting in the way that only children could be. If someone had convinced him they knew his mother, or that she had sent them. Mrs. Boudreaux. The dispatcher was still waiting for an answer. "His grandmother," Claire said suddenly. "My mother-in-law, Estelle. She lives in Metairie, but she's had some problems since my husband died. Drinking problems. I haven't let her see Marcus in months." 2 patrol cars arrived within 15 minutes, their blue and red lights casting eerie shadows on the morning bright street. Detective Ray Comeau, a heavy-set man in his 50s with greying hair and tired eyes, took charge of the scene. He'd been with the NOPD for 23 years and had worked more missing children cases than he cared to remember. Most had happy endings, but in 1990, New Orleans, with the city's murder rate climbing toward record highs, every disappearance carried an extra weight of dread. "Tell me exactly what happened this morning," Detective Comeau said, settling his bulk into one of Claire's kitchen chairs. His partner, Detective Sarah Williams, a younger woman with sharp eyes and prematurely silver hair, took notes while Claire recounted the morning's events. "The phone call confused me," Claire admitted. "I lost track of time somehow. I thought yesterday was still August. But Mrs. Tran from the school said it was September 4th, that Marcus was supposed to start school yesterday." Detective Williams looked up from her notepad. "Have you been feeling disoriented lately? Having trouble keeping track of time?" Claire shook her head vehemently. "No, nothing like that. I've been under stress since my husband died, but I'm not losing my mind, if that's what you're asking." "What about medications?" Detective Comeau asked gently. "Sleeping pills, anxiety medication, anything that might affect your memory?" "Nothing," Claire said. "I take vitamins, that's all." The detectives exchanged a glance. Detective Williams made another note. They spent the next hour canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing Mrs. Thibodeau and other neighbors who might have seen Marcus or the mysterious woman. The description remained frustratingly vague. Medium height, brown hair, blue dress. It could have been any of thousands of women in New Orleans. By afternoon, the search had expanded to include Estelle Boudreaux's apartment in Metairie. The elderly woman answered the door in a stained housecoat, reeking of gin and cigarettes. Her apartment was cluttered with empty bottles and old photographs of her late son, David. She hadn't seen Marcus, she insisted, and hadn't left her apartment in 3 days. "That girl took my boy away from me," Estelle slurred, referring to Claire. "After David died, she wouldn't let me see my grandson, said I was a bad influence." Detective Comeau studied the woman's bloodshot eyes and swollen features. "Mrs. Boudreaux, this is very important. If you know anything about where Marcus might be, you need to tell us now." Estelle's face crumpled. "I would never hurt that boy. He's all I have left of my David." The search continued for 3 days. Police officers combed through every park, playground, and abandoned building in a 10-mile radius. Volunteers from the community joined the effort, distributing flyers with Marcus's school photo, a gap-toothed smile beneath curious dark eyes. Local news stations ran the story every evening, and tips poured into the police station, but none led anywhere. On the fourth day, Detective Williams made a discovery that changed everything. She had returned to Claire's house to re-interview the mother, hoping that some detail might have surfaced in Claire's memory. As they sat in the kitchen, Detective Williams noticed something odd about the calendar hanging on the wall, the same calendar where Claire had discovered her confusion about the date. "Mrs. Boudreaux," Detective Williams said carefully, "can you show me where you marked Marcus's first day of school?" Claire pointed to the red circle around September 4th. "Right there. I wrote it down months ago when I got the enrollment packet." Detective Williams studied the calendar more closely. The red ink looked fresh, much fresher than it should have if Claire had written it months earlier. Moreover, there were faint pencil marks around the date, as if someone had erased and rewritten something. "Do you have the enrollment packet?" Detective Williams asked. Claire retrieved the papers from a drawer. The packet clearly stated that classes would begin on September 3rd, not September 4th. Someone had changed the date on Claire's calendar, creating the confusion that had left Marcus unsupervised in the front yard for those crucial minutes. "Who else has access to your house?" Detective Williams asked. Claire's face had gone pale. The cleaning lady comes on Fridays, and I gave a spare key to Mrs. Thibodeau for emergencies. But who would do something like this?" That evening, Detective Williams sat in her unmarked car outside Estelle Boudreaux's apartment building. Something about the older woman's demeanor had bothered her during their earlier visit. The grief seemed genuine, but there had been something else lurking behind those bloodshot eyes. A desperate kind of calculation that suggested someone capable of extreme measures. At 9:47 p.m., Estelle emerged from the building. She moved with the careful precision of someone trying to hide their intoxication, walking slowly to a rusted Buick parked at the curb. Detective Williams followed at a distance as the car wound through the streets of Metairie, then crossed the parish line into New Orleans. Estelle's destination surprised the detective. A small motel on Airline Highway, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and asked no questions. The Moonlight Motel's neon sign flickered erratically, casting pink and blue shadows across the cracked parking lot. Detective Williams watched from across the street as Estelle parked and walked to room 127. She knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, clearly a prearranged signal. The door opened and Estelle disappeared inside. 20 minutes later she emerged, no longer alone. A woman in a blue dress walked beside her to the car. Even from a distance, Detective Williams could see that the woman matched Mrs. Thibodeau's description of the person who had been with Marcus that morning. The car drove to a 24-hour diner on Veterans Boulevard. Detective Williams parked where she could observe the 2 women through the window. They sat in a corner booth, heads close together in intense conversation. The woman in the blue dress appeared agitated, gesturing frequently, while Estelle seemed to be trying to calm her down. After an hour, they returned to the motel. Detective Williams waited until both women were inside room 127, then called for backup. Within 15 minutes, 4 patrol cars had surrounded the building. "New Orleans police! Open the door!" The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then Detective Williams heard something that made her heart race, the faint sound of a child crying. The door to room 127 opened to reveal Estelle Boudreaux, her face resigned and defeated. Behind her stood the woman in the blue dress, who Detective Williams now recognized from missing person reports that had crossed her desk months earlier. Rebecca Santos had disappeared from her apartment in the French Quarter 6 months ago. leaving behind a suicide note and a history of severe depression following the death of her own son in a car accident. She had been presumed dead, another casualty of the city's escalating troubles, and in the back corner of the motel room, curled up on a single bed and crying softly, was Marcus Boudreaux. "Marcus!" Detective Williams called out gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're here to take you home to your mama." The boy looked up with red-rimmed eyes, confusion and fear written across his small face. "I want my mama," he whispered. "The lady said Mama sent her, but I want to go home." Rebecca Santos sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "We weren't going to hurt him," she said, her voice barely audible. "Estelle said we just needed more time, that Claire would understand eventually." "Understand what?" Detective Williams asked, though she was beginning to piece together the twisted logic that had led to this moment. Estelle answered, her words slurred, but her meaning clear. "That boy needs a proper family. Claire's working nights, leaving him with strangers. She can't take care of him the way he deserves. Rebecca lost her boy. I never get to see my grandson. It seemed like fate." The plan, as it emerged over the following hours of interrogation, was both elaborate and tragically simple. Estelle had befriended Rebecca Santos during one of her drinking binges at a Metairie bar, two grieving women whose losses had twisted their judgment beyond recognition. Together, they had convinced themselves that taking Marcus was an act of rescue, not kidnapping. Estelle had used her spare key, obtained months earlier when she had still been allowed to babysit Marcus, to enter Claire's house and alter the school calendar. She had also stolen one of Marcus's school photos and some of his clothing, items that Rebecca could use to convince the boy that his mother had sent her. The plan had been to keep Marcus at the motel for a few days, then move him to a cabin that Rebecca's deceased husband had owned in Mississippi. There, they believed, they could create the loving family that both women felt had been stolen from them by circumstances beyond their control. "We were going to write to Claire eventually," Rebecca said during her confession. "Let her know he was safe and happy. We thought she would see that we could give him things she couldn't." Detective Comeau, who had seen every kind of human tragedy in his 2 decades with the force, shook his head as he processed the paperwork. "In all my years doing this job," he told Detective Williams, "I've never seen anything quite like this. 2 women so broken by grief that they convinced themselves kidnapping was an act of love." Claire's reunion with Marcus took place at the police station, away from the media circus that had begun to gather outside her home. The boy clung to his mother with desperate intensity, and Claire whispered promises that she would never let anyone take him away again. "I'm so sorry, baby," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Mama should have been watching you better." But Marcus, with the resilience of childhood, was already beginning to bounce back. "The ladies were nice to me," he said, "but they weren't you, Mama. I knew you didn't really send them because you would have come with them." Estelle Boudreaux was charged with kidnapping and conspiracy. At 68, she faced the possibility of spending her remaining years in prison. Rebecca Santos, whose mental health history would likely factor into her sentencing, was charged with the same crimes, but would probably serve her time in a psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison. The case made headlines throughout Louisiana and beyond, not because of its violence, there had been none, but because of its heartbreaking illustration of how grief could corrupt even the most fundamental human bonds. Editorial writers and talk show hosts debated the fine line between crime and mental illness, between evil intentions and misguided love. For Claire and Marcus, life slowly returned to something approaching normal. Claire quit her night job at Café du Monde and found work at a Garden District boutique that allowed her to work while Marcus was in school. She changed the locks on her house and installed a security system that neighbors joked was more appropriate for a bank than a shotgun house. But the fear lingered. Claire found herself checking and rechecking school schedules, calling to confirm pickup times, watching Marcus with an intensity that sometimes frightened both of them. The trust that had once allowed her son to play freely in their front yard was gone, replaced by a hypervigilance that cast shadows over even the brightest days. Marcus adapted better than his mother, though he occasionally woke from nightmares about the nice ladies who weren't really nice. School counselors worked with him to process the experience, and gradually his natural resilience began to reassert itself. The story might have ended there, filed away in police archives and remembered only by those directly touched by the trauma. Claire and Marcus got on with their lives. The Garden District community rallied around them, and New Orleans continued its struggle with the escalating crime that would make 1990 one of the most violent years in the city's history. But 14 years later, in 2004, a phone call would arrive that would shatter everything Claire thought she knew about her son's disappearance and reveal secrets that no one, not the police, not the community, not even Claire herself, had imagined possible. The call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March. Claire, now 46 and working as a manager at the boutique, had just gotten home from work when the phone rang. Marcus, now 21 and in his junior year at Tulane University, was studying abroad in France for the semester. The house felt empty without his presence, but Claire had finally begun to feel secure in their quiet routine. "Hello, Mrs. Boudreaux." The voice was female, elderly, with a slight tremor that spoke of advanced age. "Yes, this is Claire Boudreaux. My name is Dorothy Santos. Rebecca Santos was my daughter." Claire nearly dropped the phone. Rebecca Santos had died 3 years earlier in the psychiatric facility, where she had been serving her sentence, a victim of heart failure brought on by years of medication and despair. The news had reached Claire through Detective Williams, who had kept in touch sporadically over the years. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Santos?" "I need to see you," Dorothy said. "There are things about what happened to your boy that you need to know, things Rebecca never told the police." They met the next day at a coffee shop in the French Quarter, neutral territory where neither woman would feel too vulnerable. Dorothy Santos was in her 70s. A small woman with carefully styled grey hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been a high school English teacher for 40 years before retiring, and there was something in her precise manner of speaking that reminded Claire of her son's second-grade teacher. "I apologize for disturbing your peace," Dorothy began, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "But Rebecca left me some things before she died, and I've been wrestling with whether to bring them to you." She reached into a worn leather purse and withdrew a manila envelope. "These are letters Rebecca wrote, but never sent. Letters to you, explaining what really happened that day in 1990. Claire stared at the envelope, as if it might contain a bomb. "I know what happened. Your daughter and Estelle Boudreaux kidnapped my son. That's what everyone thought," Dorothy said quietly, "including Rebecca at first, but the truth is more complicated than that." With trembling hands, Claire opened the envelope and removed several sheets of paper covered in Rebecca's careful handwriting. The first letter was dated December 1995, 5 years after Marcus's disappearance. "Dear Mrs. Boudreaux," it began. "I know you must hate me for what I did to your family, and I don't expect forgiveness, but there are things you need to know about that day, things I've been too afraid to tell anyone, even my own lawyer. I didn't meet Estelle at a bar like we told the police. She approached me deliberately after researching my background and finding out about my son Tommy's death. She knew exactly how to manipulate my grief, how to make me believe that taking Marcus was somehow justified. But Mrs. Boudreaux, there was someone else involved. Someone who gave Estelle information about your schedule, about Marcus's school, about the best way to confuse you about the date. Someone who wanted your son taken, though I still don't understand why. Claire looked up at Dorothy, her face pale. Who? Who else was involved? Dorothy's expression was grim. Keep reading. The second letter was longer, more detailed, and it painted a picture that made Claire's blood run cold. The day before we took Marcus, Estelle received a phone call. I was staying in her apartment then. She had convinced me to leave the motel because she said it wasn't safe. I heard her side of the conversation, and it was clear she was talking to someone who knew intimate details about your life. The person on the phone knew that you worked nights, knew about your husband's death, knew that you had been struggling with depression and occasionally took sleeping pills that your doctor had prescribed. They even knew that you had been seeing a grief counselor. Most disturbing of all, they knew about Marcus's medical records, things that should have been private. After the phone call, Estelle was different. More confident, like she had received some kind of official approval for what we were planning. She kept saying that we were doing the right thing, that Marcus would be better off with us, and that she would understand eventually. I asked who she was, but Estelle wouldn't tell me. She just said that there were people who cared about Marcus's welfare more than I knew. Claire's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pages. This doesn't make sense, she said. Who would want Marcus taken and why? Dorothy reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on Claire's arm. There's more. The last letter Rebecca wrote was just days before she died. She had remembered something important. The final letter was brief, but devastating. Mrs. Boudreaux, I remembered something today. Something I should have told the police 14 years ago. The night before we took Marcus, Estelle had a visitor. A woman came to her apartment while I was supposed to be sleeping. I heard voices in the living room and got up to see who it was. Through the crack in the bedroom door, I saw a woman in a nurse's uniform. She was giving Estelle something, papers, I think, and maybe money. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I heard the nurse say something about making sure the boy is safe and protecting him from what's coming. Mrs. Boudreaux, I think your son was taken not to hurt him, but to protect him from something, and I think someone who worked in the medical field was involved. I'm dying now, and I can't live with this secret anymore. I pray that you can find the truth, and that Marcus can finally be truly safe. Claire set the letters down, her mind reeling. A nurse, she said slowly. Someone with access to medical records. Dorothy nodded. Rebecca was convinced that whoever was behind Marcus's disappearance had good intentions, even if their methods were criminal. She thought someone was trying to protect your son from some kind of danger. But what danger? And why not just talk to me? Why go through this elaborate kidnapping scheme? I don't know, Dorothy admitted, but I think Rebecca was right about one thing. This wasn't random. Someone wanted Marcus taken, and they used Estelle and my daughter to do it. Claire spent the rest of that afternoon walking through the French Quarter, trying to process what she had learned. The familiar streets and sounds of the tourist district provided a comforting backdrop as her mind raced through possibilities. A nurse with access to Marcus's medical records, someone who knew about Claire's depression, her medication, her work schedule. Someone who had convinced Estelle Boudreaux that taking Marcus was an act of protection rather than crime. By evening, Claire had made a decision. She called Detective Williams, who had retired from the NOPD 2 years earlier, but still lived in New Orleans. Sarah, it's Claire Boudreaux. I need to ask you something about Marcus's case. Detective Williams' voice was warm but concerned. Claire, honey, what's wrong? Has something happened? Claire explained about her meeting with Dorothy Santos and the letters Rebecca had written. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Claire," Detective Williams said finally, "I need you to come to my house tonight and bring those letters with you." They met at Detective Williams's shotgun house in Mid-City, a neighborhood that had been slowly gentrifying since the late 1990s. Sarah Williams was 58 now, her silver hair completely white, but her sharp eyes hadn't lost any of their intensity. "I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago," she began as they sat in her small living room. "But I made a promise to someone, and I've been wrestling with whether to break it ever since I retired." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of promise?" "About 2 weeks after we found Marcus, I got a call from someone at Charity Hospital, a nurse named Angela Tran. Yes, the same last name as the woman who called you from Marcus's school that morning. Linda Tran's sister." The room seemed to tilt around Claire. What did she want? She wanted to know if the case was really closed, if we were still investigating. I told her that Estelle and Rebecca had confessed, that we weren't looking for anyone else. And then she said something that stuck with me all these years. Detective Williams paused, clearly struggling with her decision to reveal this information. She said, "Good. Then the boy is finally safe." When I asked her what she meant, she got scared and hung up. I tried to follow up, but Angela Tran had quit her job at Charity and moved away. No forwarding address. Claire stared at her in disbelief. "You never investigated this? You never told me?" "I tried to investigate," Detective Williams said defensively, "but Angela Tran had vanished, and Linda Tran claimed she hadn't spoken to her sister in months. Without any evidence of wrongdoing, and with 2 people already confessed to the crime, my superiors told me to let it go." "So you just let it go?" Detective Williams' face flushed with shame. "I made a judgment call that I've regretted ever since. But Claire, you have to understand. In 1990, we were dealing with a murder epidemic. The department was stretched thin, and we had solved this case. My captain wasn't interested in pursuing conspiracy theories when we had dozens of unsolved homicides." Claire stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out onto Sarah Williams's small backyard. The former detective's explanation made sense from a practical standpoint, but it didn't ease the betrayal she felt. "So what you're telling me," Claire said without turning around, "is that there was evidence of a larger conspiracy from the beginning, and the police department chose to ignore it." "I'm telling you that I made a mistake," Detective Williams replied quietly. "And if you want to pursue this now, 14 years later, I'll help you in any way I can." Claire turned back to face her. "Marcus is in France until December. When he gets back, he's going to want answers about why his childhood was stolen from him, and I'm going to make sure I have them. Over the next several months, Claire and Sarah Williams worked together to uncover the truth about what had happened in 1990. It was slow, frustrating work, complicated by the passage of time and the fact that many of the key players were dead or missing. Their first breakthrough came when they tracked down Linda Tran, who had left her job at St. Augustine Elementary in 1995 and was now working as a school administrator in Baton Rouge. Initially reluctant to talk, she eventually agreed to meet with them at a restaurant halfway between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Linda Tran was a small, nervous woman in her 50s, with graying black hair and worried eyes behind thick glasses. She had clearly been dreading this conversation for years. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking questions," she said, as they settled into a corner booth at the rural diner she had chosen for their meeting. "Tell us about your sister Angela," Sarah Williams said gently. Linda's hands twisted in her lap. "Angela was a good person, but she got involved with the wrong people. In the late 1980s, she was working in the pediatric unit at Charity Hospital, and she started noticing irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Children who came into the emergency room with injuries that didn't match the stories their parents told. Kids who seemed terrified of going home. Angela tried to report her suspicions through proper channels, but nothing ever seemed to happen. Claire leaned forward. What does this have to do with Marcus? Linda took a shaky breath. In early 1990, Angela became convinced that there was a network of people, doctors, nurses, social workers, who were protecting certain children by removing them from dangerous situations, not through official channels, but through other means. Kidnapping, Sarah Williams said flatly. They didn't see it that way, Linda said quickly. They thought they were saving children who would otherwise fall through the cracks of the system. Claire felt sick, but Marcus wasn't in danger. I was a good mother. Linda's face crumpled. Angela got it wrong. She misinterpreted information in Marcus's medical file, something about your husband's family history, your own struggles with depression after his death. She convinced herself that Marcus was at risk, and she reached out to people she thought could help. Estelle Boudreaux, Sarah Williams said. Linda nodded miserably. Angela knew that Estelle had lost access to her grandson, knew she was desperate to have him in her life. It seemed like a perfect solution, a grandmother who wanted to protect her grandson, and a child who supposedly needed protection. So Angela orchestrated the whole thing, Claire said, her voice barely controlled. She called me the night before it happened, Linda admitted. She asked me to call you the next morning to create confusion about the school schedule. She said it was the only way to get Marcus to safety without traumatizing him. And you went along with it? Linda's eyes filled with tears. Angela was my little sister. She had convinced herself she was saving your son's life. I thought if I helped just this once, maybe she would get the psychological help she needed. The full scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its tragic, misguided intentions. Angela Tran had assembled a network of well-meaning but criminally misguided individuals who believed they were operating an underground railroad for endangered children. Estelle Boudreaux hadn't been a random collaborator. She had been carefully chosen and manipulated by people who saw her desperate love for her grandson as a tool they could use. Rebecca Santos had been selected not just for her vulnerability, but for her nursing background, which made her seem more credible to a trusting child like Marcus. The entire plan had been orchestrated by people who genuinely believed they were performing a rescue mission. "Where is Angela now?" Claire asked. Linda shook her head. "I don't know. After Marcus was found and she realized how wrong she had been, she disappeared. I got one letter from her about 6 months later, postmarked from California. She said she was trying to make amends for what she had done, but she couldn't face the people she had hurt." They left the diner with more questions than answers, but at least Claire finally understood the scope of what had been done to her family. The kidnapping hadn't been the random act of two grief-stricken women. It had been orchestrated by a network of people who thought they were above the law, people who had decided that they knew better than the system they had sworn to serve. Marcus returned from France in December 2004, tanned and confident, full of stories about his semester abroad. Claire waited until after Christmas to tell him what she had discovered about his kidnapping. They sat in their living room, the same room where she had answered that fateful phone call 14 years earlier, and she explained everything. Marcus listened without interruption, his face growing more serious as the story unfolded. When Claire finished, he was quiet for a long time. "So they really thought they were saving me?" he said finally. "They were wrong about everything," Claire said quickly. "You were never in danger from me." Marcus reached over and took his mother's hand. "I know that, Mom. I've always known that. but I can almost understand how people who deal with real child abuse every day might make mistakes, especially when they're not thinking clearly. Claire stared at her son in amazement. At 21, he had developed a capacity for forgiveness that she wasn't sure she would ever possess. "What do you want to do with this information?" Marcus asked. "Do you want to try to find Angela Tran? Do you want to press charges against Linda Tran for her part in it?" Claire had been wrestling with these same questions for months. The statute of limitations had run out on most of the charges that could be brought against the conspiracy's members, and pursuing them now would likely accomplish nothing except reopening old wounds. "I think I just wanted to understand," she said. "For 14 years, I've blamed myself for not watching you closely enough that morning. Now I know that no amount of vigilance could have prevented what happened, because it was planned by people I trusted." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Then maybe it's time to let it go." But letting go proved more difficult than either of them had anticipated. In January 2005, Sarah Williams called with news that would shake their newfound peace. "Claire, you need to know that Linda Tran called me yesterday. Angela Tran is dead." Claire sank into a kitchen chair, the same chair where she had received the phone call about Marcus's absence from school 15 years earlier. "What happened?" "She killed herself last week in a motel room in Los Angeles. But she left something behind. A confession letter addressed to you and Marcus." The letter arrived by express mail 2 days later. It was 23 pages long, written in Angela Tran's careful nursing school handwriting, and it contained a detailed account of the underground network she had helped to create and operate. Between 1988 and 1990, Angela wrote, the group had rescued 12 children from what they perceived as dangerous situations. In most cases, the children were placed with relatives who had been denied custody through official channels. In a few cases, like Marcus's, the children were intended to be returned to their families once the perceived danger had passed. But the group had made catastrophic errors in judgment. They had misread signs of abuse, misinterpreted family dynamics, and convinced themselves that their good intentions justified their criminal actions. By the time Angela realized how wrong they had been, it was too late to undo the damage they had caused. "Mrs. Boudreaux," the letter concluded, "I have spent the last 15 years trying to find ways to make amends for what I did to your family. I have donated money anonymously to missing children organizations. I have volunteered at shelters. I have tried to live a life that would honor the innocence I stole from your son. But I have never been able to forgive myself, and I don't expect you to forgive me either. I only hope that knowing the full truth might bring you some measure of peace. Your son was never in danger from you. You were exactly the kind of mother that every child deserves. I was the danger, and I will carry that shame until I die." Claire read the letter 3 times before she was able to speak. When she finally looked up at Marcus, who had been reading over her shoulder, her face was streaked with tears. "She destroyed so many lives," Claire said, "including her own." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you angry with her?" Claire considered the question carefully. "I'm angry about what she did, yes, but reading this letter, I think she was sick, Marcus. I think her guilt and her need to save children had made her mentally ill, just like Rebecca Santos was mentally ill." "Do you forgive her?" Claire looked at her son, this remarkable young man who had grown up strong and compassionate despite the trauma that had been inflicted on him. "I forgive her," she said finally. "Not because she deserves it, but because carrying this anger isn't helping anyone anymore." The story of Marcus Boudreaux's disappearance became a cautionary tale that was studied in social work schools and law enforcement academies across the country. It illustrated the dangers of vigilante justice, even when practiced by people with good intentions, and the importance of following proper legal procedures when children's welfare is at stake. For Claire and Marcus, however, it became something else entirely, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to overcome even the most devastating betrayals of trust. Marcus graduated from Tulane in 2006 with a degree in social work. He went on to law school and eventually became a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children, but one who always insisted on thorough investigations and due process, no matter how clear-cut a case might seem. Claire continued working at the Garden District Boutique until she retired in 2015. She never remarried, but she found peace in her relationship with her son and in the knowledge that she had been a good mother, despite what well-meaning but misguided people had tried to tell her. The house on Magazine Street, where the nightmare had begun on that humid September morning in 1990, became a gathering place for family holidays and celebrations. The front yard where Marcus had played before his disappearance was once again filled with children, his cousins and the children of family friends, who ran and laughed under the same oak tree where Beignet the cat had once hidden. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the New Orleans air hung heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of jazz drifted from the French Quarter, Claire would sit on her front porch and remember that terrible day when her world had fallen apart. But now, instead of dwelling on the fear and confusion, she chose to focus on what had been restored, a son who had grown into a remarkable man, a relationship that had survived the ultimate test, and the hard-won knowledge that love, in the end, is stronger than fear. The phone call that had shocked New Orleans in 2004, Dorothy Santos's revelation about her daughter's letters, had indeed changed everything, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of bringing more pain, it had brought understanding. Instead of reopening wounds, it had finally allowed them to heal. And in a city that had seen too much tragedy, too much violence, too much loss, the story of Claire and Marcus Boudreaux became something rare and precious, a reminder that even the darkest mysteries can sometimes have endings that honor the capacity of the human heart to forgive, to heal, and to love without reservation.